The hospital corridor reeked of antiseptic as Dr. Nathaniel Carter, 38, scrubbed his hands, preparing for surgery. A nurse passed by, thrusting a mop toward him. "Clean room 5, please." He glanced down, unfazed. Minutes later, a code blue blared overhead, and the janitor they dismissed became the surgeon they desperately needed. The overhead lights in the corridor of St. Mary's Medical Center in Chicago flickered faintly, just enough to cast soft shadows on the pale linoleum floor. Fluorescent halos buzzed above the bustle, and the sharp scent of antiseptic lingered, masking the more human aromas of sweat, stress, and stale coffee. Doctor. Nathaniel Carter walked with measured steps, his ID badge clipped securely to his chest, its lanyard draped over a navy scrub top with a faint trace of starch. His shoulders were squared, his chin tilted just enough to exude quiet authority, yet his eyes, keen and reserved, caught the glances that weren't meant to be noticed. 2 nurses passed, muttering under their breath. "Must be the new janitor." "Yeah, why is he near the OR? Someone should tell him." Nathaniel didn't flinch. He'd heard it before, in med school, during residency, even once on rounds. Not everyone said it aloud, but sometimes the silence between words spoke louder than insults. He pressed on. Outside the surgical suite, a young white intern, Ethan Brooks, 28, leaned against the doorframe, coffee in hand, all swagger and a stethoscope slung carelessly around his neck, a look that hadn't yet earned its place, but thought it had. Ethan tilted his head toward Nathaniel and grinned. "Wrong door, buddy." Nathaniel paused for a second, their eyes locking briefly. No smile, no anger, just stillness. Then he turned the handle and stepped inside, leaving Ethan's smirk hanging in the air like a punchline that missed its mark. Inside the surgeon's lounge, it wasn't much better. A few doctors looked up, barely concealing their confusion. One muttered to another, Nathaniel catching only the tail end. "Guess the janitors' union gets fancy uniforms now." No one greeted him. No one nodded or said, "Hey, Doc." He glided past them, opening his locker with smooth precision, retrieving surgical folder stuffed with neatly organized pre-op files he'd studied for the past 48 hours. A high-risk aortic valve case, complications likely. He knew the anatomy like the back of his hand. They didn't know he was leading this case. They didn't even think to wonder. At the coffee machine, he poured a cup, hands steady, jaw clenching just once when someone tossed a crumpled paper towel his way. It missed the trash can, landing at his feet. The man didn't apologize. Nathaniel stared at him for a moment, then stepped around it, refusing to pick it up. He owed no one that. In the corner, an attending physician, Dr. Richard Feldman, 57, graying and respected, glanced up, recognition flickering in his eyes. He opened his mouth, then closed it, saying nothing. Even those who knew often stayed silent, but Nathaniel never needed to shout. His silence was its own kind of thunder, low, steady, undeniable. Every breath he took in that room was an act of defiance. Every quiet moment. He didn't explain himself louder than the whispers swirling around him like smoke. He checked his watch. Surgery in 20 minutes. He adjusted his surgical cap, sipped his coffee, and turned, back straight. Shoulders calm, not because he didn't feel the sting of judgment, but because he'd long learned dignity often came from restraint. Let them whisper, let them doubt. They were all in for a surprise. He didn't need to tell them who he was. The operating room would do that for him. The sterile calm of the hospital shattered in an instant. Code blue or 2. Repeat, code blue or 2. A voice cracked over the intercom, sharp and urgent. For a split second, the world held its breath. Then chaos erupted. Footsteps thundered down the corridor. Nurses grabbed gloves. Surgeons shouted names and orders. And a crash cart barreled past in a blur of rattling tools and adrenaline. In the surgeon's lounge, coffee cups clattered as chairs scraped back, conversations dying mid-sentence. Everyone froze, eyes wide, scanning each other, waiting for someone to step up. "Who's on call?" someone asked, voice tight. "Dr. Patel," a nurse replied, already on the phone, "but he's at least 15 minutes out." "This patient doesn't have 15 minutes. The words hung like a ticking clock, cold and final. Another voice, higher, near panic. "We need a lead, now." But no one moved, no white-coated figure with the confident chatter from 10 minutes ago. Not the intern with the smug laugh, not those who'd whispered about janitors' uniforms and wrong doors. They stood frozen, caught between their titles and their fear. Then, from the back of the room, a calm, steady voice cut through the noise like a scalpel. "I've got it." Heads whipped around. Standing in the doorway, framed by the fluorescent light spilling from the corridor, was Dr. Nathaniel Carter. Posture relaxed, but eyes dark, focused, unyielding, carrying the gravity of a man who'd walked this tightrope before and never slipped. His scrub cap was on, his badge now unmistakably clear, glinting. Dr. Nathaniel Carter, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery. The silence that followed wasn't just shock. It was realization, the dawning awareness that they hadn't seen him. "Not really," a junior nurse stammered. "Wait, you're—" But Nathaniel didn't answer her. He didn't need to. "I need vitals and a team prepped in OR2, he said, already moving. Orders were shouted. Feet scrambled to follow. In under 60 seconds, the corridor's tone shifted. No more assumptions, no more laughter, just clipped affirmations and professionals moving like a machine because a captain was at the helm now. Nathaniel passed the nurse who'd handed him a mop earlier that day, her face flushed with memory. He didn't glance at her. There was no time. Inside her, too. The air hummed with tension. A man in his 50s lay unconscious on the table, his heart barely registering a flutter on the monitor. A ruptured valve, internal bleeding, a race against time. Nathaniel stepped in, movements fluid and practiced. He didn't need to announce his credentials. The way he moved did that. "Vitals dropping. Pressure 60/40, the anesthesiologist called. "Clamp ready, retractors. Artery here. Suction on my left, now." Nathaniel's voice was calm, but firm. Each directive met with instant action. The intern who'd mocked him stood just outside the viewing window, eyes wide behind his glasses, watching Nathaniel navigate the failing heart. with the confidence of someone who'd done it 100 times. An attending, who'd once mistaken him for a janitor, whispered under his breath, "My God, he's saving him." The procedure took just under 10 minutes. 10 minutes, where every second carried the weight of life and death. And Nathaniel, steady hands, sharp mind, silent grace, bore that weight without faltering. When the cardiac monitor finally emitted a rhythmic, beautiful beep, the room exhaled. "He's stable," the anesthesiologist said quietly. Nathaniel nodded, peeling off his gloves. "Keep monitoring. He'll need a full post-op protocol. I'll brief the family." With that, he stepped back, letting the adrenaline ebb from his shoulders, his scrubs damp with effort, his breathing measured but full. The nurse who'd handed him the mop looked at him, her eyes no longer saying, "You don't belong here," but rather as if he'd walked on water. "I'm sorry," she started, barely above a whisper. He met her gaze, not angry, not smug, just weary. "I don't need your apologies," he said softly, then walked out. The OR doors swung shut behind him, and for the first time that day, the whispers stopped. Only respect remained. The OR's double doors parted with a quiet whoosh as Dr. Nathaniel Carter stepped through. The air was thick, tense, sterile, tinged with antiseptic and the urgency of a life hanging by a thread. Surgical lamps hummed faintly overhead, casting harsh white halos on the unconscious patient draped beneath. The monitor beeped erratically, tracing a faltering heart rhythm, fighting to hold on. A half-assembled team stood at the table, a scrub nurse arranging tools, an anesthesiologist tracking vitals, and a young white surgeon, Dr. Michael Hayes, barely 30 at the center, mask pulled over his eyes. Nathaniel approached the sink, wordless, scrubbing methodically, hands moving with swift, purposeful strokes, soap swirling down the drain like discarded thoughts. There was no room for anger here, not now. The young surgeon turned at the sound of footsteps, eyes widening. "Wait, you're—" He froze, confusion softening into recognition. "You're Dr. Carter." Nathaniel met his gaze calmly, voice even. "Yes, I'm leading this procedure." The other man blinked, stepping aside without protest. This wasn't about ego anymore. It was survival. They all knew who was best equipped for a cardiothoracic crisis. A tense silence settled. Then, across the table, movement. The nurse, who'd earlier shoved a mop into Nathaniel's hands, froze mid-instrument count. Her face, paling beneath her mask, she too finally saw him, not as some janitor she could order around, but as the chief surgeon, the man she dismissed without a glance. She swallowed, shame crashing over her like a tidal wave, but Nathaniel said nothing. He didn't need to. He turned, hands up, gloves ready, eyes flicking to the patient's vitals. BP 58 over 35, irregular rhythm, severe arrhythmia, valve likely torn. The anesthesiologist reported almost too eagerly. Nathaniel nodded. "Prep the valve kit, rib spreader, retractors ready." Everyone moved at once, the dynamic shifting in seconds from chaos to precision. Every action now rhythmic, every second accounted for. He leaned over the patient, the monitor's faint beeps fading under his steady breathing. The first incision was smooth, deliberate. The scrub nurse handed him a scalpel, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to mask the regret in her eyes. Still, Nathaniel didn't acknowledge her, not with coldness, but with discipline. This wasn't the time for reckoning. It was the time for saving. The chest cavity opened like a locked story, finally revealing its ending. The heart was in bad shape, swollen, spasming, drowning in its own weakness. To someone else, it might have seemed hopeless, but not to Nathaniel. "Clamp! Arterial here. I need more exposure on the left." His voice was low, steady, like a conductor guiding a symphony, directing every note. The young surgeon who'd stepped aside watched in awe, barely breathing. The nurse followed every instruction, her hands seeking redemption. Even the anesthesiologist leaned forward, as if witnessing something sacred. Minutes passed, then more. Nathaniel didn't look up, his hands sure, each motion executed with quiet intensity that silenced even the machines. The monitor's beep, beep, beep began to stabilize. The worst was behind them. Valves in, sutures holding. "Prep for closure," he finished with the same quiet grace he'd entered with. No drama, no pride, just purpose. When it was done, the chest cavity sealed, the heart beating strongly on its own. Nathaniel slowly peeled off his gloves. He nodded to the team. "Good work, everyone. Keep him monitored in post-op. He should stabilize within the hour." The silence that followed wasn't born of fear or surprise. It was respect. Raw, undeniable, earned. As Nathaniel moved to the door, the nurse who'd mistaken him stepped forward, hesitant. "Dr. Carter," she said, voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry." He paused, then looked at her, not with bitterness, not with triumph, but with quiet, weary honesty. "I know," he said simply. And with that, he stepped out of the OR, leaving behind not just a saved life, but a room forever changed. The truth had finally dawned, and it wore surgical scrubs, walked tall, and didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. The OR doors closed softly behind Dr. Nathaniel Carter, sealing in the heavy silence and the faint scent of surgical triumph. Back in the corridor, the midday hum of the hospital resumed, but something was different. The air felt thinner, as if the entire building had exhaled. Nurses moved with new mindfulness, eyes lingering a moment longer on every badge they passed. Conversations hushed as Nathaniel walked by, replaced by the click of respectful silence. In the waiting area outside the OR, word was already spreading. The janitor had saved a life, except he wasn't a janitor. He was the chief cardiothoracic surgeon, and now no one could unsee it. Hours later, the patient, Mr. Robert Hensley, 52, a schoolteacher and father of 3, was wheeled into the ICU. Monitors hummed in steady rhythm, a flush returning to his cheeks, his chest rising and falling, evenly beneath a thin hospital blanket. The worst was over. A head nurse in post-op muttered to her aide, "He wouldn't have made it without that surgeon. What's his name again?" Nathaniel Carter, came the quiet reply. Chief of Cardiothoracic. The name passed from mouth to mouth like wildfire, people who'd never acknowledged his presence now craning to recall him. Later that day, at a hastily convened meeting near the surgical wing, hospital leadership gathered. Dr. Margaret Ellison, chief of staff, a stoic woman with graying hair and a tablet tucked under her arm, stood at the head of the group. Her tone was formal, but her words carried a hint of reverence. I want to commend Dr. Carter for his swift, decisive actions during today's Code Blue. His leadership in the OR saved a patient's life under extreme pressure. She turned to Nathaniel, who stood to the side, hands loose, eyes calm, but alert. We're proud to have someone of his caliber on our staff, and I expect all departments to extend the respect his title and skill demand. A few claps started, awkward at first, then stronger. Some genuine, some just catching the cue. Nathaniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the recognition, but inside he wasn't seeking applause. He never had. He just wanted them to see. As the small crowd dispersed and people returned to their posts, the corridor quieted, the flurry of praise and face-saving gestures fading like the end of a passing storm. Then she appeared, the nurse from earlier, the one with the mop. Her posture was different now. The brisk confidence gone, the aura of authority she'd wielded like a shield replaced by quieter steps. Dr. Carter, she said, her voice almost a whisper. He looked up from the chart he was reviewing. She hesitated. I wanted to say I'm sorry for earlier, for assuming. Nathaniel watched her for a moment, her hands clasped tightly, knuckles pale, her eyes no longer avoiding his, holding a mix of guilt and humility. He didn't snap, didn't shame her. Instead, he closed the folder in his hand and met her gaze calmly. Next time, he said, voice quiet but firm, check the badge first. The words weren't a slap, but a clear, inevitable truth. She nodded, her face flushing. You're right. He didn't smile, didn't comfort, just that single line, because it was a lesson, and now she had to carry it. For the rest of the day, Nathaniel walked the corridors, not as an invisible man, but as something else entirely. Eyes met his now. Doors were held open. A few interns nodded in respect, something they hadn't done before. Some were too embarrassed to speak, others too proud to apologize. It didn't matter. Respect couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned, and more importantly, recognized. Nathaniel had done both. He didn't need validation. He had a life he'd saved, a truth he'd lived, and the quiet power of doing his job well, even when no one expected it of him. Later that evening, he passed a janitor, an older black man pushing a cart down the corridor. Their eyes met for a moment, and the janitor gave him a knowing look. The first real acknowledgement Nathaniel felt all day. The janitor didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He just knew.